Do you see evil when you look at me? Do you see a monster or just a man sitting across from you, speaking plainly? Welcome to a journey into the minds of America's most infamous death row inmates, men whose names still send a chill down the spine. This isn't just about the crimes they committed, it's about the masks they wore, the final things they said, and even the meals they chose before stepping into eternity. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this again. Let's begin. Ted Bundy, State, Florida. He was clean-cut, charming, a law student with an easy smile. To the outside world, Ted Bundy looked like the guy you'd trust to carry your groceries, or maybe even babysit your kids. But behind that polished exterior was a predator hunting in plain sight. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy left a trail of devastation across 7 states. He didn't stalk his prey in dark alleys. No, Bundy operated in broad daylight, libraries, college campuses, and shopping centers. He'd fake an injury, wear a sling, or pose as a cop. Always polite, always persuasive, until the moment he wasn't. His signature tactic, ask a woman for help, maybe to lift books into his iconic Volkswagen Beetle, and once she leaned in, he struck. Sometimes he broke into homes at night, attacking women as they slept. At least 30 victims have been confirmed, but experts suspect the real number is far higher. Bundy's confidence was so blinding, he managed to escape police custody. Twice. Once by jumping out of a courthouse window, and again by slipping through a ceiling vent in jail. But his final spree ended in Florida in early 1978, after a series of brutal attacks at Florida State University and the abduction of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Even behind bars, Bundy played games. He spoke of his crimes in riddles. He toyed with investigators, offering details only when it suited him. As his execution date loomed, Bundy opened up in a desperate bid to delay the inevitable, admitting to murders he'd long denied. His last morning came on January 24, 1989. No special requests. He was served the standard: steak, eggs, hash browns, toast, milk, juice, and coffee. As witnesses gathered to watch him take his final breath in the electric chair, Bundy's parting words were simple: "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." John Wayne, Illinois. If Ted Bundy wore the mask of the boy next door, John Wayne Gacy took things one step further. He became the community clown. Literally. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy was a man about town in suburban Chicago. He ran a successful business, rubbed shoulders with politicians, and dressed up as Pogo the Clown to perform at children's parties and hospital events. He shook hands, made people laugh, and lived a double life, darker than fiction. Beneath that painted smile was something monstrous. Gacy targeted teenage boys and young men, many from vulnerable situations. He'd lure them in with promises of work, cash, or just a place to hang out. What followed inside his modest home was unspeakable. One by one, his victims vanished without a trace, until a 15-year-old named Robert Peist went missing. Peist had mentioned meeting a contractor about a job. That contractor was Gacy. When police began watching him, they noticed something strange: the reek of decay wafting from beneath the house. The truth was buried in the crawl space, literally. Investigators uncovered the remains of dozens of boys, hidden beneath the floorboards and around the property. The total body count would rise to 33. During his trial in 1980, Gacy claimed insanity and said different personalities had committed the murders. The jury didn't buy it. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to die. After more than a decade on death row, Gacy's time ran out on May 10, 1994. For his last meal, he chose a comfort food feast: fried shrimp, KFC original recipe chicken, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. And his final words? Cold and unapologetic. As the lethal injection took hold, Gacy muttered, "Kiss my ass." Timothy McVeigh, federal. April 19, 1995. The morning began like any other in downtown Oklahoma City, until it didn't. At precisely 9:02 a.m., the ground trembled as a thunderous explosion ripped through the heart of the city. Smoke swallowed the skyline. Sirens screamed into the chaos. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building had just been obliterated by a truck bomb so powerful it shook buildings miles away. In the wreckage, 168 lives lost. 19 of them were children, innocent toddlers who'd been dropped off at daycare that morning. Over 680 people were injured. Hundreds of structures were shattered beyond recognition. It was at that point the deadliest act of homegrown terrorism in American history. The man behind it all? A former Army soldier named Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh wasn't driven by money or fame. His motive was vengeance. Disillusioned with the U.S. government, he viewed the bombing as payback for the federal raid on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, 2 years prior. That siege ended in flames and the deaths of dozens, and McVeigh never forgave the government for it. So he planned, calculated, built a bomb using fertilizer, racing fuel, and hate, loaded it into a Ryder truck, parked it just outside the building, and walked away. Unbelievably, McVeigh was arrested less than 2 hours later, not for the bombing, but for driving without plates and carrying an unlicensed gun. At the time, police had no idea they'd just nabbed the man responsible for such a catastrophic crime. But soon, clues began to fall into place. A vehicle identification number on a piece of the truck's axle led investigators straight to him. McVeigh wasn't alone in his plot. Terry Nichols, his old Army buddy, was charged as a co-conspirator. Another associate, Michael Fortier, testified against him to save himself. But it was McVeigh who faced the full weight of justice. He never showed remorse. No apologies, no second thoughts. In 1997, a federal jury found him guilty of 11 counts, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction. The sentence was death. On June 11, 2001, at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, McVeigh was executed by lethal injection, the first federal execution in nearly 40 years. He made no final speech. Instead, he handed out copies of a poem, Invictus. Its closing line, now infamous, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." For his last meal, he chose something oddly childlike for a man who had taken so many young lives: 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Gary Gilmore, Utah. Before Gary Gilmore's name became cemented in criminal history, he was already well on his way down a path of destruction. Born into a fractured Texas family in 1940, Gilmore's early life was a storm of violence, neglect, and rebellion. His teenage years were marked by arrests, and his adult life a carousel of crime, prison sentences, and rage. But it was the summer of 1976 that sealed his legacy. Just months after being paroled from a long prison stint, Gilmore went on a chilling 2-day murder spree in Utah. His victims? 2 men who did nothing but comply. First was Max Jensen, a gas station employee in Orem. Gilmore demanded money and still pulled the trigger. The very next night, in a Provo motel office, he gunned down Benny Bushnell, again with no provocation, no resistance. It was as if Gilmore wanted to kill, simply to prove he could. He didn't get far. A family member noticed blood on his clothes and reported him. Police quickly found the murder weapon and physical evidence tying him to both crime scenes. His guilt was never really in question. But what happened next stunned the nation. Unlike most facing death row, Gilmore didn't want a stay of execution. He didn't beg for clemency. In fact, he fought against the appeals filed on his behalf. "I've been on death row all my life," he said. "I'd just like to get it over with." He meant it. Gilmore attempted suicide twice to avoid delay. He rejected legal lifelines. His refusal to fight the sentence created a media frenzy. Protesters, lawyers, journalists, everyone had an opinion. But Gilmore didn't care. And so, on January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore faced a firing squad. It was the first U.S. execution in nearly a decade following the Supreme Court's reinstatement of capital punishment. His death reopened the national conversation on the ethics and effectiveness of the death penalty. Gilmore's last meal was simple: a hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, a baked potato, and several cups of coffee. His last words were fewer still, but unforgettable: "Let's do it." Ironically, that defiant phrase lived on. Decades later, it would inspire Nike's global slogan, "Just do it." Gilmore left behind more than a criminal record. He became a symbol, a story, a debate. His life and death sparked books, documentaries, even a film. But at his core, he remained the same man he'd always been: angry, reckless, and unapologetically ready to face the end. Stanley Tookie, California. Stanley Tookie Williams lived 2 drastically different lives. In one, he was the street-hardened co-founder of the Crips, one of the most violent gangs to ever emerge from Los Angeles. In the other, he was a death row inmate who became a symbol of redemption, writing books for children, preaching against violence, and receiving multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominations. Williams grew up in South Central LA, surrounded by poverty and danger. By 17, alongside Raymond Washington, he helped form the Crips, a group that would soon spiral into a violent criminal empire, fueled by drugs, turf wars, and fear. Whatever their original intention, the Crips quickly became synonymous with destruction, and by 1979, Tookie's own crimes had reached a point of no return. That year, during a robbery at a 7-Eleven, Williams forced a clerk named Albert Owens into a back room and shot him, execution style. Owens didn't resist, he simply followed instructions, but Williams pulled the trigger anyway. Just 12 days later, during another robbery at a family-run motel, 3 more people were murdered in cold blood. Yin Ai-yang, his wife Tai Shi, and their daughter Yi-Chen Lin, shot at close range. The total amount stolen across both robberies? Less than $250. Williams was arrested shortly after. Prosecutors built their case on testimony from informants and accomplices who claimed he boasted about the killings while behind bars. Tookie, for his part, insisted he was innocent, but the jury didn't believe him. He was sentenced to death. That could have been the end of his story. But inside San Quentin, something shifted. Williams began renouncing gang life. He used his time to write a series of books warning young people away from the world he once helped create. He even developed a peace guide, the Tookie Protocol, aimed at helping rival gangs resolve conflicts without bloodshed. His transformation caught the world's attention. Celebrities, activists, and educators rallied behind him. Many argued that executing Williams would mean silencing someone who had become a powerful voice against the very violence he once helped unleash. But not everyone was convinced. Critics pointed out that Williams never directly apologized to the victims' families. He never admitted guilt. And in the eyes of California's governor at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, that lack of personal responsibility outweighed his redemption. On December 13, 2005, the state moved forward with the execution. At 12:35 a.m., Williams was pronounced dead by lethal injection. For his last meal, he made no special request. He was given the standard: oatmeal, milk, and fruit. In his final moments, Williams stayed true to his position. He maintained his innocence, saying, "The state of California is about to execute an innocent man." He turned his attention to young viewers, offering a somber message. To all the youth, I want to apologize to you all for allowing myself to be used to further create this monster of gangs and gang violence. Ronnie Lee, Utah. Ronnie Lee Gardner's life reads like a slow-moving tragedy, marked by violence, desperation, and ultimately a final act that etched his name into American history. Not for just what he did, but for how it all ended. He was the last man in the U.S. to be executed by firing squad, a method that felt like something from a bygone era. Born in 1961 in Salt Lake City, Gardner never really had a chance. His childhood was a bleak storm of poverty, abuse, and neglect. By 10, he was already inhaling glue to dull the pain. By 11, he was institutionalized in a psychiatric facility. The world failed him early, and he returned the favor with rage. As a teen, Gardner was no stranger to the inside of a jail cell. By 18, he had a robbery conviction under his belt. But it was a deadly encounter in 1984 that marked the beginning of his final descent. While out on parole and attempting another armed robbery, he shot and killed bartender Melvin Otterstrom. He was caught and awaiting trial. But the most chilling moment came less than a year later, during a court appearance that should have been routine. On April 2, 1985, Gardner was escorted to the Metropolitan Hall of Justice in Salt Lake City. What no one knew was that his girlfriend, Karma Hainsworth, had smuggled a handgun into the courthouse. In a flash, she passed it to him. What followed was chaos. Gardner tried to escape. In the process, he opened fire. Attorney Michael Burdell, a bystander with no connection to Gardner's case, was shot and killed while crouching for cover. A bailiff was also wounded before Gardner himself was shot, subdued, and returned to custody. The irony was cruel. Burdell, the victim, was a known opponent of capital punishment. Later that year, Gardner was convicted of capital murder. When asked how he wanted to die, he didn't flinch. He chose the firing squad. I lived by the gun, he said. I'll die by the gun. And yet Gardner's years on death row were far from static. Over the next 25 years, he claimed to have reformed. He read voraciously, meditated, and envisioned launching a program for at-risk youth, an initiative he called Back to Basics. He imagined teaching kids to grow food, learn discipline, and escape the cycles he never did. A noble vision, though it came too late. As his execution approached, there were passionate calls for clemency. Some pointed to his poor upbringing, others to the symbolic cruelty of the firing squad. But the legal system stood firm. On June 18, 2010, at Utah State Prison in Draper, Gardner faced his final moment. The execution chamber had been retrofitted for the rare event. A metal chair bolted to the floor, sandbags to catch stray bullets, a paper target pinned over his heart. 5 anonymous marksmen stood behind a wall. Only 4 rifles held live rounds. One was loaded with a blank, ensuring no shooter could be certain of delivering the fatal shot. Gardner's final meal was indulgent: steak, lobster tail, apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and a 7-Up. In his last moments, he remained composed, accepting, "I do not fear what comes. When it comes, it comes." Juan Diction, federal. Juan Raul Garza didn't just run a drug empire, he ruled it with an iron grip and a loaded gun. In the early 1990s, his marijuana trafficking operation stretched from Mexico through the southern U.S., bringing in millions. But it wasn't the drugs that ultimately sent him to death row. It was how he protected his business, with calculated executions. Garza wasn't the kind of boss who left things to chance. He believed in sending messages, swift, final, and fatal. He personally ordered the murders of 3 men he suspected of betrayal or cooperation with law enforcement. Their names were Thomas Rumbo, Gilberto Matos, and Erasmo de la Fuente. Each was shot at close range. It wasn't rage, it was control. Witnesses later testified that Garza used murder as part of his leadership strategy. Loyalty was rewarded, disloyalty was answered with death. In August 1993, authorities finally caught up with him. Arrested and tried in Texas, Garza faced a mountain of evidence: surveillance, informant testimonies, and ballistics linking him directly to the killings. In the courtroom, the empire he'd built unraveled. His conviction came swiftly, multiple federal charges, including 3 counts of murder. The verdict shocked many, not just because of the crimes, but because of what happened next. Garza became the second person to be executed by the federal government since the reinstatement of the federal death penalty. The first had been Timothy McVeigh, just days earlier. Now the spotlight turned to Garza, the first Latino man to face federal execution in the modern era. On June 19, 2001, Garza entered the death chamber at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. For his final meal, he chose a traditional comfort spread: steak, fries, onion rings, slices of bread, and a Diet Cola. But unlike McVeigh, whose silence was calculated, Garza's final words were steeped in remorse. "I just want to say that I'm sorry, and I apologize for all the pain and grief that I've caused. I ask for your forgiveness. God bless." In the end, the empire he ruled with violence left behind nothing but grief, empty chairs at dinner tables, and yet another reminder of how power, when unchecked, can destroy more than just lives. It can erase legacies. State Oklahoma. Some crimes sear themselves into the memory because of their brutality. Others become infamous because of how justice was carried out. In the case of Clayton Lockett, it was both. The year was 1999. Lockett, along with 2 associates, Sean Mathis and Alfonso Lockett, set out to settle a score in Perry, Oklahoma. What was supposed to be a drug-related intimidation job turned into something far darker. Inside the home they invaded was 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman, a recent high school graduate with a quiet strength that refused to bend. When ordered to hand over her keys, she refused. When threatened, she stood her ground and insisted she'd report the men to the police. That small act of courage cost her everything. The trio abducted Stephanie and drove her to an isolated area. There, in a cold, calculated act, Lockett shot her twice. But the horror didn't end there. The men dug a shallow grave and buried her while she was still breathing. The autopsy later confirmed that she had been alive, gasping for air, as the dirt fell around her. Lockett was arrested shortly afterward and charged with murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and armed robbery. The courtroom showed no mercy. In 2000, he was sentenced to death. His co-conspirators, Mathis and Alfonso, received lesser sentences, life in prison and 25 years respectively. But Lockett's name would not be remembered only for what he did. It would be remembered for what happened on the day the state of Oklahoma tried to execute him. April 29, 2014. At the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Lockett was strapped to a gurney. What unfolded over the next 43 minutes would ignite a nationwide firestorm over the death penalty in modern America. Oklahoma had recently altered its lethal injection protocol, turning to a new, untested cocktail of drugs. This change, coupled with the medical team scrambling to find a viable vein, set the stage for catastrophe. After multiple failed attempts, the IV was finally placed in his groin, a risky and unconventional location. At 6:23 p.m., the sedative midazolam was administered. At first, it seemed routine, but what followed was anything but. 10 minutes in, Lockett started moving violently. He writhed, clenched his teeth, and even lifted his head, visibly struggling. He wasn't supposed to be awake. Witnesses watched in horror as the scene unfolded, until officials hastily closed the blinds, shielding what came next from public view. The execution was officially halted, but it was too late. Lockett suffered a massive heart attack and was pronounced dead at 7:06 p.m., nearly 3/4 of an hour after the process had begun. An investigation later uncovered what had gone wrong. The IV had come loose, leaking the toxic drugs into surrounding tissue instead of the bloodstream. As a result, Lockett was never fully sedated. He was aware, in pain, and dying in slow motion. The botched execution shook the nation's conscience. Legal experts, human rights advocates, and politicians began to question the reliability and humanity of lethal injection itself. Lockett's final meal had also drawn attention. He'd asked for steak, shrimp, baked potato, garlic toast, pecan pie, and ice cream. But Oklahoma had recently imposed a strict $15 cap on last meals. Rather than accept the substitute, Lockett declined entirely and was served the regular prison tray. Unlike many before him, Lockett never gave a final public statement. There were no last words as the execution began, just the quiet knowledge that, behind the curtain, something had gone terribly wrong.